With technical formalities out of the way, I want to again say good morning and welcome to this workshop from Islanders at the Helm, themed Building Coalitions in the Face of Climate Challenges, Options to Upend Caribbean Archipelagic Precarity. I am Lysanne Charles. I am a PhD researcher at Islanders at the Helm, and I'm based at the University of St. Martin. As a part of today's workshop, which is held publicly in keeping with our Islanders at the Helm mandate to include and engage with community stakeholders, we have a lecture by Dr. Anaís, Roque, and several responses from our various work packages. But first, we have an introduction by Program Chair and one of the principal investigators at the Islanders at the Helm, Dr. Francio Guadalupe. Dr. Guadalupe, you are free to take the mic.
Good afternoon or good morning to some of you. Thank you for being part of this discussion, dialogue, conversation that we'll be having today. And we are honored that Dr. Anaís Roque will actually be presenting some of her ideas and some of her work for us. She works, if I take it spatially, she works in Puerto Rico, she works around the Mexican borderlands, and she works in Arizona. She's an anthropologist, and she studies or is interested in households, or what Americans call communities and community experiences, as they prepare and respond to food, energy, and water security in the wake of a hazard or a disaster. Hazard can be geophysical or climatological. Now, this ties nicely into what we are doing with Islanders at the Helm. Dr. Roque is specialized also in mixed methods, as they're called. So she does participatory mapping, she studies secondary data, she probably also does surveys, photo voice, and so forth, and so forth. So I think what we'll do is we'll have Dr. Roque first address us, and then Lysanne will lead the conversation. Let me just say that Dr. or Professor Antonio Carmona Baez of the University of St. Martin, who is co-chair in this project, could not make it today, and he sends his apologies. The second co-chair, Professor Corinne Hoffman, will be tuning in a bit later, but I think given that your time—
I'm here.
Corinne is here.
Hi.
Oh, great. Given your time,
Hello.
I think you can then start the session. I pass it on again to Lysanne. Thank you.
Dr. Roque, you can now go ahead and start your presentation, and thereafter we will have the responses.
Perfect, will do. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be in conversations with you all today. So I will start by sharing my screen here quickly. You would imagine that after 2 years on Zoom, you can do this in a more flawless way, but it always takes me a little bit of time. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Awesome. Thank you again for taking from your time to attend this presentation and for the invitation. My name is Anaís Roque, and I'm excited to be in conversation with you all today. So the title of my presentation is Climate Change, Neoliberalism, and the Quest for Adaptation in the Caribbean. The underlying focus of my talk within climate change is disasters. I define disasters as an unnatural phenomenon, but really as a political and manufactured by preference of economics over people's well-being, racism, and colonialism. While I've had some experience doing community engaged work and thinking about climate change, my entry point to this research agenda really began 5 years ago when Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico and the archipelago was completely devastated. In the wake of this Category 5 hurricane, roads were blocked, water and power services were out. There was just really a vast humanitarian crisis. And in the aftermath of Maria, I worked as a shelter administrator in charge of the well-being of approximately 80 residents and coordinating with different government agencies and nonprofit organizations to bring food, water, clothes, and really emotional support to displaced residents. During these challenging times, I also worked with Red Cross and Rubicon informally, giving water and supplies to communities in Western and South Puerto Rico. So during these experiences, while I was observing how the lack of local and state preparedness for the hurricane season impacted communities island-wide, I also really saw how residents worked with little to nothing to support their neighbors, their families, and broadly the most vulnerable communities around them. And really, this is the experience that excited my passion to study how human societies can plan for and respond to complex disasters. So to begin, I would like to just kick us off with a structure of this talk. I'd like to provide you a roadmap to think with me about climate change with a focus on three main things. One, how neoliberalism and colonialism play integral parts to anthropogenic climate change. Two, what types of adaptations low-income households engage to respond to cascade impacts from these events. And then three, what can we do within our limitations with a focus on scholars, but also acknowledging that we have a broader audience of members from different sectors, including community partners. So I would like just to kick off with some basics on climate change in the Caribbean that I think are already of well knowledge in this room, but it just helps us be in the same place. So how is anthropogenic climate change impacting the Caribbean? I think that the first important thing in this question is that the Caribbean is not a monolithic, and that our different colonial and indigenous upbringings is really what shapes our mitigation and response strategies to hazards and climate change. However, given our shared region, we do have some very similar challenges when it comes to these impacts from anthropogenic climate change. The most evidence are through our coastal management, tourism, human health, agriculture, and really just the increased intensity and frequency of weather-related hazards. As we might know, according to the IPCC, the average temperatures of the Caribbean region have increased by 0.0 Celsius to 2.02 Celsius per decade over the past 3 decades. With increased temperatures, people's ecosystems and economies, as we know in the Caribbean, will continue to be significantly impacted in many ways. Among these includes loss of lives and livelihoods, decreased food and water security, increased migration, loss of infrastructure and settlements, degradation of human health and overall well-being, but at the same time, loss of cultural resources and heritage. Yet, it's also really important to recognize that climate change is a result of decisions that drive increased dependency on fossil fuel economies, and that Latin America and the Caribbean countries contribute less than 10% of total greenhouse gas emissions. Let me say that again. They contribute less than 10% of greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, small island developing states contribute less than 1% to the total greenhouse gas emissions. Yet, we continue to be mostly impacted by climate change, highlighting some of the really injustices that we face. For example, small island developing states experience losses from climate change and weather events that really result in approximately 20% of their social expenditure as compared to 1.2% of North America or less than 1% in Europe and Central Asia. This again showing the distributed injustices in benefits and burdens from these decisions. When it comes particularly to disasters, Caribbean islands are 7 times more likely to be impacted by a hazard that's at least larger than other countries. And when they're hit by hazards that turn into disasters, their average cost of damage relatively to their gross domestic product is 6 times higher than other countries. So this forces many Caribbean islands and small developing islands to turning to international markets for funding, and this practice has been documented as being increasingly unsustainable, given it creates larger constraints to the region's long-term prospects for growth. As part of the decision-making processes that lead to climate change, my research puts in front and centers neoliberalism and colonialism. Our colonial history has shown how our economy and body really has been viewed as objects to advance well-being elsewhere, particularly in the case of Puerto Rico as a U.S. colony, how it benefited first Spain's economy, our first colonizers, and then the United States of America. Currently, colonial practices continue to be present in Puerto Rico, as seen, for example, with the federal appointment of the Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act, called PROMESA, which means promise, ironically. This was established in 2016, and it's really a financial board, control board, that is intended to guarantee the payback of government debt to bondholders through austerity measures. The board decisions are made in New York City, which is more than 1,000 miles away from where these decisions make the real impact. Currently, the board has made decisions that impact an array of social services, including water and electricity tariffs, public health services, as well as to facilitate the sale of public land and natural resources, amongst others. Within this context, I particularly use secondary data to contextualize how neoliberalism and colonial governance affects the lives of Puerto Ricans, as seen through issues of food, energy, and water systems. And at the same time, how these create insecurity experiences. And by insecurities, I mean access, availability, quality, reliability of these essential resources at all time for human health and well-being. My empirical work then focuses on both the bottom-up responses that are utilized mainly by low-income communities or households to contextualize what it means for them in terms of benefits and burdens of their experiences, as well as then thinking broadly back again to these macro systems. What influences do they have to change the dynamics that force them to engage in these strategies in the first place? Particularly, I would like to focus on how neoliberalism and colonialism are experienced through food, water, and energy systems. When it comes to food and its relation to colonialism and neoliberalism, a cascade effect is food insecurity. In the last 3 decades, Puerto Rico has seen a decline in the share of local food production, which has led for Puerto Ricans to have an increased dependency on imported food, which has reached to at least 85% of the food in the island being from elsewhere. Once Puerto Rico was an agriculture exporter, but now Puerto Rico's agriculture only accounts for 0.62% of the island's GDP. Additionally, to these problems, we are under the Jones Act, a 1920 law that was designed to protect the U.S. mercantile marine, which requires that all shipments in Puerto Rico is done by U.S.-built ships. And this results in higher prices overall for food items, especially concerning for food supply when it comes to disasters. At the same time, given Puerto Rico's high poverty status, we are very dependent to federal support, and particularly to food stamps. And these have not, research has shown that these have not met households' insecurity needs, especially in times of emergencies like natural hazard impacts. So therefore, in the wake of disasters, food insecurity becomes a very prevalent topic for many households across the archipelago. When it comes to energy, we have a similar story. The electrical services, as we know, they are really core of any country's critical infrastructure and ideals of growth and progress. And in Puerto Rico, residents have faced many challenges and disruptions within the system. The Puerto Rico Electric Company, called PREPA, it's really one of the largest power utilities in the United States because of the number of consumers that it serves. As of 2020, Nonetheless, Prepa received approximately 97% from electricity from fossil fuels, including coal, gas, and petroleum, and only 2.57% from renewable sources, including hydropower, solar, and wind. Throughout time, a combination of internal, including operational deficiency and fiscal management, as well as external, including the deterioration in aged infrastructure, along with hazards like hurricanes and earthquakes, have tested the robustness of this critical system. The cascading effects of Prepa's vulnerability has really relied on the impacts to businesses and residents that now experience higher utility bills, frequent power outages, and environmental pollutants. To put it in context, in the wake of Hurricane Maria, Puerto Rico experienced the largest and longest power outage in U.S. history, with some households reporting not having electricity 1 year after this event. 4 months after Maria, the governor then announced the initial process to Prepa's privatization. The reason behind this neoliberal shift included technical maintenance and fiscal failures linked to bipartisan management. But following the goals of privatizing Prepa in 2021, in June, Luma Energy, which is a US-based Canadian company venture, became the new manager of this system. And really what this has become is a challenge to workers' retirement funds, larger and more frequent power outages, as well as challenges including corruption, energy injustice, and the pathways for participation in energy-related decision-making, which goes along the lines of energy colonialism and thinking about Puerto Rico's energy future. Lastly, when we think about water services, again, it's a very similar story. The Puerto Rico Aqueduct and Sewer Authority, also known as PRASA, is a government-owned corporation who is responsible for the water quality, the management, and supply of 97% of the households in Puerto Rico. The remaining 3% utilize small water systems under EPA, Environmental Protection Agency regulations. PRASA is the only entity authorized to conduct such business in Puerto Rico. But in the past years, PRASA has been denoted to have drinking water supply systems that face, first, high leakage rates, second, lack of financial capital, and third, an overall just inadequate maintenance. Despite being the primary source for drinking water for 97% of the population, PRASA repeatedly violates federal health standards, with up to 70% of the population receiving water that exceeds acceptable contaminant levels, as outlined by the Federal Clean Water Act. And this is more than any other state or territory in the United States. Again, when in the 2017 hurricane season, when Hurricane Irma hit in September 6th, it crossed the northeast area of the island and it left 13% of residents without water services. 2 weeks later, when Hurricane Maria hit, 92% of the clients were left without water services. This occurred primarily because of the lack of maintenance of PRASA, but also because of dependency of the Puerto Rico Power Authority, which left 100% of the island without electricity. So once again, being more than 1,000 miles away from the U.S. mainland, colonial practices like the Jones Act limited Puerto Ricans to obtain aid from other countries, nearby countries that were ready to support fellow people from Puerto Rico. During these times, PRASA recommended that Puerto Ricans boiled or used chlorine taps as their water treatment because their plants were without service. But here, really, Puerto Ricans were often forced to rely on unsafe water like rivers and wells, and at least 26 people were killed by leptospirosis. Nearly a year after Hurricane Maria, thousands of water bottles were found unopened and expired in eastern Puerto Rico. And then 3 years later, residents also found relief aid, including water, in a governmentally managed warehouse. Overall, really what the experiences of Puerto Ricans are seen through food, energy, and water systems highlights is just state negligence, the impacts of privatization, and a prioritization of markets over people's well-being. But at the other end, the necessity of residents to engage in self-reliance to secure water, food, and other life-dependent provisions. So in this context, my research has been interested in not only contextualizing residents' experience with these structural conditions, but what strategies they engage to respond, or as many has rightfully so argued, survive state negligence in anthropogenic climate change. In this sense, I have focused on two, at times, complementary areas. One is social capital and the other one is self-management. And I'll dive into those in a bit. So really, social capital became of interest as part of my PhD program because I was interested in social networks, so meaning the structures of the relationships that link social actors, especially considering what I saw in the wake of Maria, but also really that our social world is mainly made up, about our family and our friends, our work partners and acquaintances. So in this way, I saw social network studies as one that can help us understand how information is shared, how collective decisions are made, as well as how resources are mobilized. Likewise, how individuals and communities can use their networks to create safety nets to rely on one another. Much of the social network disaster literature today, for example, continues to be interested in some of these questions, especially how the individuals seek to identify their typical social networks, the mobilization, the activation, or deactivation of these social ties, and the impacts of the various support configurations. Particularly drawing and building from social network theory, social capital is defined by the density of networks of trusting and beneficial relationships. I like to really think about social capital as your social relationships as your currency. These relationships generate and produce assets that can advance your objectives. For example, in collective action research, social capital has been shown as extremely valuable for resource exchange, institutional function, and aspects of trustworthiness. Some of the key aspects that drive social capital include trust, shared norms, shared values, and reciprocity. At the individual or personal level, social capital can be conceptualized as these social structures that can be accessed and mobilized purposely to address an immediate need. But viewed as a collective or at a community level, social capital is defined by connections amongst several individuals at different horizontal and vertical levels to enact through reciprocity and advance a common goal. As an overall social system, social actors, social capital is intended to support collective work and engagement. But within social capital, there are different types of social capital, and households and communities can enact them in different ways. For example, the three main ones are bonding social capital, bridging social capital, and linking social capital. Bonding social capital refers to relationships within a community with those with similar backgrounds, like your friends, like your family, like your neighbors. Bridging social capital relates to relationships with more diverse communities, such as social groups that include civil organizations, universities, the church, and others. And lastly, linking social capital relates more to vertical relationships, and these are with institutions of power, including city personnel, nonprofit organizations, foundations, and others that can enact more of a structural or larger scale infrastructure change. Communities, like I mentioned, can use one or a combination of these to advance a particular agenda. In my research and my collaborations, it has been mainly to advance resilience, the ability of a community to advance forward through sustainable infrastructure. And for example, one of my closest collaborators and community partners are community leaders from Corcovado. Corcovado is a community that is located in the mountains of the municipality of Añasco in Western Puerto Rico. Corcovado has been very successful in utilizing their social capital in several ways. This community, I have to express, has been organized for over 40 years and is composed of at least 1,600 residents. They're organized given the lack, they started to organize over 40 years ago, given their lack of safe and reliable water for drinking and sanitation in the community because the government didn't want to connect water to them. The members of the community have stated always that the importance of their social capital in terms of how they don't sit and wait for anybody else to come and how they will use what they have to address their needs. For example, they have fought to obtain an elementary school from their neighborhood, which was closed as part of neoliberal policies by the Department of Education, and they transformed it into a community gym, a community office, a computer center, and a health area for visiting doctors or nurse practitioners. In the aftermath of Maria, Corcovado was really one of the communities that recovered the fastest, and in part was because of their years of building different types of social capital. First, their bonding social capital. So in the aftermath of Maria, Corcovadas used their social capital to organize within their community and open roads to access to the community, as well as to develop logistics for food security from residents, as well as to support households that had lost everything. They really tapped on each other's strengths in terms of getting bulldozers and related materials to be able to open access to their remote community. Second, bridging social capital was used through their connections and establishment with university partners, with the church and other civil societies that they have been working with, and they help them bring access to water resources and also food and diesel, because they're organized around this water aqueduct that because of the challenges of getting gasoline, they weren't able to operate their water aqueduct. And lastly, their linking social capital can be seen mainly through how they use their shared goals and objectives to sustainability and resilience to get a battery system that can allow operate their solar panels so they don't have to be reliant on their fossil fuels to operate their water aqueducts. So Corcovado really represents an example of being a community that has used their resources to advance issues of sustainability and resilience. On the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, while being concerned with social relationships and in the face of a disaster, I've also been interested in how communities practice survival outside of the state. And for this, the concept of autogestión really became very central to those conversations. Autogestión has two interesting debates, which I test throughout my dissertation research and current research. First is that autogestión, traditionally, it's intended to be a practice where those involved are engaging in it without state, without financial power, or without any type of external support. It's supposed to be a total and radical transformation of society. For example, much of the work that is done on autogestión in Puerto Rico has focused on the ways that organized groups seek transformation in the case of decolonization, energy justice, social justice, climate justice, but also as a counter-practice survival, again, to this state violence. However, other social scientists that study autogestión have argued that in the context of neoliberalism, states allow self-management because the state is focused in supporting the well-being of the markets, while for social assistance, people must play a more active role in generating their own well-being. So in other words, really is that as the state abandons the ethics of social responsibility, individuals will develop a culture of self-sufficiency, one that does not really change the hierarchical structures that force individuals to engage in self-management in the first place. At the same time, under this model of autogestión, individuals are in an unstable position because they are presented that their personal space as the only one where they can make action and have an impact in in really the only space where they can work to address some of the externalities that have created these larger systems. So given the recent debates in the literature, another, in a way, social adaptation strategy that I have explored is how autogestión is enacted in the case of Puerto Rico with a focus on post-disaster recovery, water insecurity, and water sharing. Particularly, this is of interest because the implications that engaging in water sharing as a disaster response can do, including physical health and mental health. So to understand just quickly the concept of water sharing, why I focus on water sharing as a form of autogestión, water sharing is inter-household water arrangements to meet daily needs, such as cooking, sanitation, washing clothes, bathing, etc. The scholarship on water sharing comes from anthropologists thinking about how communities respond to cases of extreme water needs. And particularly, water sharing has been documented as transfers where there's a range of expectations, but mainly expectation is not acted in return. Particularly, I used water sharing in disaster contexts because it had not been studied in this form, has been studied in other water insecure localities across the world. And my research, which utilized 81 interviews across 3 diverse geographies, rural, urban, and peri-urban, tried to understand how water sharing looked. So, for example, as an autogestión form at the household level, it really was about logistics to get water from different sites, like formal sites like the government sites, or informal sites like water rivers and wells. But then at the community level, as this quote in the screen that I'm sharing, it was more about how households can respond to these issues in a way that it supports communities. And particularly, it was about how members of the different neighborhoods that I did interviews with were taking from the little that they had to give to those that they saw that were more in need. And they were hearing about this mouth to mouth. So, for example, elderly people, people with disabilities, women, and just really trying to represent norms of solidarity, because there was no financial capital involved, no state involved. And overall, really, residents continue to say to me that they wanted to support others that were in more vulnerable positions, acknowledging government negligence as acting as first responders, especially because the government was also focused on urban centers, and for more rural communities, it was harder to access these, given also the lack of electricity and then gas dependency, etc. So within this context of the experiences, a key question of my research on autogestión and water sharing as a form of autogestión was to understand if these experiences better align with some of the radical transformation traditional scholarship, or if it was more towards this neoliberal reaction view of autogestión. And for this, I have 3 main points that I want to make. The first one is that autogestión, as experienced by these particular households, does provide some elements of radical transformation within the context of disaster response. So people were able to mobilize, meeting each other's needs, relying on their existing social networks without the state, without financial capital. And in this way, it helped ensure the human right to water in the face of state abandonment. So this type of collaboration presents important foundations for some radical political transformation. But autogestión in this case also greatly aligned with the views of a neoliberal reaction. It's important to note that participants in this work engaged in spontaneous water arrangements that were not planned, and they collaborated because they saw a human need for water. But there were no further plans to advance a political agenda against this, as it's been seen in other cases. Participants reported, in addition to that, to having really feelings of no control over their own response. They felt responsible for others. And while there was an acknowledgement of the failed roles of the state, they continued to say that they had to share water with others in order to support their own well-being. So I think that importantly, this contrasts a lot of the ongoing and organized autogestión initiatives in which communities have previously come together to work against political, economic, or environmental disturbances in the wake of a hazard, and where there's actual capacity training to activate networks, as well as to create new networks to advance strategies in resilience and sustainability. A final point is that autogestión creates some serious challenges for participants' health. So similar to what I mentioned when I was talking about water broadly, individuals that engage in autogestión for water in the aftermath of Maria rely heavily on river, streams, and wells. And reliance on this untreated water poses huge health threats, such as gastrointestinal illnesses. So I also found that people reported chronic back pain from carrying water, a lot of emotional distress from water worry and water availability, at the same time also for water collection. So this, in a way, reinforces the critique that autogestión within these experiences is part of a deregulated system where individuals must take upon the roles and responsibilities of the state without prior preparation, really. So I do want to highlight that even though autogestión in these experiences and water sharing, particularly as a response post-disaster strategy, it does show yet that there's some value on conversations with, for example, emergency managers, because this is a practice, a strategy that has been engaged in different scenarios, including disaster scenarios. So in a way, it does show that it can address immediate water needs. But when done proactive, it can also reduce emotional distress and risk from drinking untreated water sources, and the necessity to maybe then use chemicals to treat water if it's not untreated. So in this way, I really want to just overall highlight that the experiences both of social capital and water sharing as an autogestión, they bring immediate benefits to those who engage with them. But these are also not solutions to systemic issues. I have advocated in different forums for their consideration in policy, for their inclusion in community level coordination in emergency management response, because doing them in a very proactive form can bring benefits to communities. Yet it's important to still acknowledge that policymakers can rely on them, as we see with the neoliberal views of autogestión. So I would like to just turn the last part of my talk to just reflect a bit with you all and think of what can we do within our disciplines, our sectors, and support climate change adaptations in the broader Caribbean region. So in 2013 is when I had my first community university partnership. And at that time, I really didn't realize the value of what a meaningful collaboration for all parties involved. When I think about climate change and adaptation, I go back to that and other experiences and find thinking myself, who is benefiting from my research? With whom can I share these findings to move thinking forward? What limitations do I have as a grad student and now as a faculty member on a tenure track appointment, which really also makes me think, how can I engage better with my collaborators? So I think that overall we can do it all. And one key value of collaborations is tapping on member strengths and challenging our thinking, because the challenges that we're facing currently in the 21st century are wicked. They're complex, and we really can't solve them with looking at them from one perspective. And this means that we also need to take the time. It's going to take resources, it takes money, it takes, but most importantly, it takes willingness to engage in this, because it can be life-changing, not only in short term, but for really long-term sustainable goals. So I have a couple of slides left that I would like to just go over with some of the ideas that have come around throughout my several collaborations where I have been involved as a government employee, a community partner, as a student, as a researcher, assistant, and now as a faculty member. The first one is disciplinary integration. And I think that this is very salient in Islanders at the Helm, right? It's that in order to build the next generation of Caribbean scholars, we need to push our students and researchers to think beyond disciplinary lines. Disciplinary research certainly brings many values to the field, but these wicked problems need holistic solutions. And I think what you are all doing here in Islanders at the Helm is at the forefront of that, particularly thinking about multidisciplinary collaborations, interdisciplinary collaborations, transdisciplinary collaborations, and in the future, probably also convergence, meaning developing new tools, new theories that fully integrate different approaches. The second one is engagement, and it's really community engagement. And community can mean many things. It can be community leaders, it can be NGOs, it can be politicians, business owners, utility, etc. I think really that the level of community engagement in projects depends on many things, from capacity of the team members for engagement, from the capacity and willingness and availability of the community, funding, goals of the projects, but really in the center of that, and most importantly for me, is to set expectations, is to discuss objectives and goals and see what community partners are interested in. It's about open lines of communication, because the project might not be fully engaged in terms of having the community members as full co-researchers, but at least there's expectations set at the beginning of it. And most importantly, that it gives an opportunity to share research findings back and to also have an opportunity to hear what is of interest to these stakeholders. The third is to center justice. There's great literature around water justice, energy justice, all sorts of justice. And I think restorative justice literature, even though it comes from criminal justice, I think it brings really good value of thinking about climate change adaptation in the future of our region, because justice from these views acknowledges the legacies that has been led to this moment and centers those in the conversation for accountability and finding ways of healing. When we think about restorative justice, we're thinking about reparations, we're thinking about how to put front and center those mostly impacted by it to find sustainable solutions that can meet their current and lives. Fourth is to acknowledge who are our end users. If we want to make our science count, we must learn to communicate in ways that make sense for those in decision-making spaces. I think that one way is to think, how can we make this work for a politician? How can we think about this for the private sector? And for me, I think sometimes that's the harder part, because I want to just scream at politicians and the private sector, particularly polluters, like, climate change and colonialism, and you guys should just be abolished completely. But we need to find ways to make it of interest to them, to make it that it shows that it would advance also their own agenda. Lastly, within our university, I think that our students and research centers, if available, are key in this process. Sometimes we might not be able to monetarily compensate our students, but there's research credits and there's other opportunities that can enhance their resumes or their CVs as a way to do so. Especially for community engaged products, students can support in applied products like videos, infographic, policy briefs, story maps, and all of these products are essential to communicate our science better outside of academia. And I think students' excitement and and ways of thinking because of their lived experiences is also set key and center to advancing meaningful collaborations and thinking holistically about these issues. So lastly, I would just like to end with this famous slogan, nothing about us without us. I think climate change is here. Obviously, climate change is impacting our communities the most, and real change cannot happen without those mostly impacted at the table. I try to look at these problems from a holistic point, trying to think about power relationships. And I think that I personally take a very political view around these issues, but overall, I think that within our different spaces, within our limitations and opportunities, there are chances to do meaningful work that can be transformative, even within the university. So I'm just, again, excited and grateful for the opportunity to be in conversations with you all, and I look forward to hearing some questions and thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Roque, for your very thought-provoking lecture. And right now we're going to have several responses from the various work packages. Each should take about 10 to 12 minutes. First up, we have from work package 1, which deals with archaeology, my colleague Harold Kelly, who was from and joins us from Aruba, where he was recently a part of the organizing of a very successful conference. So Harold, please unmute your mic and start when you are ready.
Thank you, Lysanne. Thank you, Anaís, for this interesting presentation. There's several things that really struck me. One of them was that the part that in Puerto Rico, the boats have to be built in the US to go there. That for me is really interesting that they still have that structure. I wanted to ask about the Corcovado initiative, and how does the rest of Puerto Rico experience this initiative, and how can it be translated into the rest of the other communities in Puerto Rico?
Thank you so much, Harold. That's a really great question. So Corcovado at times is almost like an outlier because they've been organized for so many years. But what I have seen in my research, in my experience with them, is that particularly bonding social capital, so those relationships within the community, can be built through shared goals. So for example, tapping on the existing community leaders, there's community leaders across Puerto Rico. And the idea really is that thinking about sustainability and thinking what it means for the value of the community moving forward, and acknowledging that sometimes the government will not be there to address their particular needs. So there's another community that I have worked with in Eastern Puerto Rico, whose name is Mariana, and they have a similar strategy, right? They're organized around ideas of sustainability and thinking about resilience. And that has really what's helped them really scale up these initiatives of bringing different types of infrastructures within their community to advance these goals for climate change. I think that now that Puerto Rico continues to be impacted by severe extreme weather events, and that our critical infrastructure systems continue to fail, there's more leaders that are engaging and tapping in their social capital. They might not call it social capital, but they are tapping within their communities. They are collaborating across communities and with institutions of power, not necessarily the government, but funding agencies, etc., to think about climate change. So Corcovado is one of those examples, but there are many other communities in Puerto Rico. I wouldn't say they're the majority. I think there's a lot of work to do, and partially because of the time, the availability. I didn't talk much about it, but Puerto Rico has had if I'm not mistaken, 10% of outmigration in the last decade. So a lot of our youth is leaving. And that's one of the key problems that Corcovado experiences, is becoming a reliably elderly population. And they're very worried about knowledge transfer, and they're worried about transferring their social capital, because they have been building this for the next generation, and the next generation is leaving because there's no jobs, right? So it's kind of like how these two forces of the macro systems that force people to be out, and then the bottom-up initiatives that are trying to build something for the community.
Yes, thank you. The other thing that really struck me is the part about science communication and transfer of scientific knowledge. During the workshop here, that's also something that I realized more in depth, and that I will be putting a lot more attention to it, and also to engage more people. Because we did a lot of PR, but the amount of people that attend these events are always not, let's say, a very big group of people.
Yeah.
So I'm really going to focus on that and see where, if it has to do with maybe overload of media or information or activities at the same time. So we're going to really put the group together to see how we can find out how we can engage more people and get into their interest. And the other thing that also I think I realized during this workshop is the part that making climate change more understandable for people, because there's people that deny it and there's people that are, let's say, there's two extremes. And I think the people that deny it, and on both sides of the spectrum, is important to get them both, let's say, more into the center, so that they have an understanding of what it means and how it's going to impact and what the possibilities are. So that was very interesting also.
Thank you. Yeah, if I could just say quickly, yeah, definitely the climate deniers, right? I think that we have to find ways. I did as a grad student, I did a study abroad to Hong Kong, and this is where I started to learn more about that. It was around urban sustainability in Hong Kong as another island archipelago in that part of the world. And one of the things that really struck me about that was that we had a speaker that talked about how they're making the airport more sustainable. And the way that they approached that conversation was not really thinking about sustainability, was really thinking about the economic cost that engaging in sustainable practice will benefit the people within the airport, right? And not necessarily that's how we are trained. I think we're trained to put the science front and center. It's about sustainability, it's about the sustainability goals. But for people that are not within those sectors, they sometimes, not that I don't care, but they just don't see how that adds to their own value. So that's I think that's really important. And these days I think that like social media, TikTok, these videos are thinking about story maps, right? Like more visual and more manageable stuff can be helpful in trying to do some of that knowledge transfer. I don't think necessarily that education enacts change. I think it's education and pressure, but education certainly is a big part of breaking some of those denials.
Yes. Lastly, I just want to add that during this workshop, I also realized the power and relevance of art as a way to transfer information in a different way instead of using language, which can connect people more to the issues and the solutions proposed. So yes, that's something that really struck me during this workshop. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and if I can just say something about that, one of my closest colleagues, his name is Jan Cordero, and he's an engineer, but he's an artist at heart. He's a graphic designer, and he's the one that does all the visual stuff in my work. And I've learned to value and to see the power within art and visual art. So one of our projects now that's looking at food, water, energy, and security is gonna use photo voice, right? The photos, we're gonna do a art photo exhibition, but as part of that, we're also gonna use VR. So we're gonna try to, scan a house and show how insecurities are presented. And it's this idea of visually engaging people into those conversations, because sometimes that helps more than what 1,000 words in my papers can say. And that was really also a big criticism throughout my PhD program. It was like, how can we make sustainability and art, like an art image? Like, how can we think about those things? So again, it's part of that opening and thinking more holistically in how to impact different communities. We're visual learners, so yeah.
Thank you very much, Harold, for your contribution. That is if you don't have any more questions. I don't want to cut you off if you still have a few more to go. So let me know.
I just wanted to ask something. I see that everywhere we have the same problem with, let's say, the governmental institutions, that although their purpose is to let's say, be there for the people and, provide for the people, somehow that doesn't happen. And it seems to me that, or I ask myself, is there a way that people in those positions can understand what they're supposed to be doing, or is it because there are other entities or institutions that toward which they have to work? Because it's very striking. Everywhere you have the same problem.
Yeah. I will give you the political approach and then my personal opinion. I think that, and even working within the government, when you're elected as a politician or a decision maker, you have to adhere to the people that got you into that position. And we traditionally think that those are voters, but really at times those are people that are funding your campaign. So if you have the values of the people that are funding your campaign drive at times some of the decision makings that occur in these spaces, right? When thinking about climate reparations and thinking about like sustainability goals. And that is very evident in Puerto Rico. For example, the governor has been accused to have relationships with the Fiscal Control Board, with Luma Energy, his family members as well, right? So there are these like ties that go beyond what we could actually control. From the other side, I think that that's why a lot of my work, I front and center also politics, because I think that voting and engaging in different types of thinking of alternatives is a key to moving those people. Sometimes the people that are in power are not the people that represent our own interests. So if they don't represent our own interests, why do we have them there? Like, we should be trying to advocate for people that move our interests, right? Fronts and centers, climate change, adaptations, and so forth. And I think that for academics, that's kind of a hard path, because we are trained to work our science and to not be activists or public facing scholars. And I think that as part of the challenges that we're facing, because they're so new and in terms of the intensity and the frequency and becoming more and more unsustainable, we also have to start thinking within our own positions, how political, or how can I engage, which are the parties or the entities that represent that, and how can we support those as well to be in that decision-making table. So yeah, it's a tricky thing, I think, and I really there's multiple angles. I don't think voting is the only way to do it, right? There's other ways to advance and think about climate change and in decision-making spaces. But I do think that if the people that are in those spaces are people that are pro-polluters and green gas emissions, like there's nothing we can do to change that, because they are being incentivized by other people. And we have to find our ways, our own strategies to incentivize the people that we would like to see there as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks again, Harold. Next, we have from work package 3, which deals with anthropology, work package 2, which deals with anthropology, my colleague, Dr. Charissa Granger, who was a musicologist from Aruba with Windward Island roots, who joins us from Trinidad. Charissa, you may now take the mic.
Thank you, Lysanne. Firstly, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, especially my fellow respondents for sharing their reflections. I would also especially like to thank Dr. Roque for sharing your work with us. It is really giving, especially at this reflective moment that we all face that is vital, actually, to all of us as we are thinking about and in our ongoing practices of world making, and also thinking about Caribbean futurity, right, out of the disruptions that we're facing and that we continue to face. So today I'm starting with something that inspired me, together with reading Dr. Roque's work, which is a piece of a poem from Dionne Brand. And she says, "I won't tell you my exploits escaping this taxonomy. Someone walked the way a perfume walks. It was what was left after labor, after time itself, small, the implications." And this is from Nomenclature for the time being. So my response engages my takeaway from your work, Dr. Roque, and what inspired me and gave me room to meditate was the practice of autogestion and resiliency theory. So autogestion, as you have offered it through your ethnography and your research in Puerto Rico, ushers in a great deal of possibilities. Autogestion, that is self-management, here emerges, and I quote, to create radical forms of decentralized resistance, to disinvest and resource extraction resulting from the state's active disinvestment in public services, privatizing them instead, and promoting the deregulation and protective environment policies, and compromising the land as well as the people that live on it. So autogestion illustrates that the devastation has the potential to inaugurate a different way of being, which I like. And together, doing this together in the face of what Arturo Escobar and Bonaventura dos Santos call the individualism brought on by colonial capitalist machinations, which you touch on in your presentation. So I would like to engage the blind spots of autogestion, which you have already flagged for us in relation to larger governmental, economic, and political frameworks, right? Some of which, again, you have attended to. Also flagging how the state can easily co-opt such practices of self-management to somehow actually maintain control. So this connects to the theoretical concept of resilience and practical aims and efforts to build resilient communities through autogestion. So you reference Matheson in your work, underlining that precautions should be taken when applying resilience to a social system, as social systems can bounce back to the same form of state as prior to the disaster, which is not necessarily adaptive, as it can set the stage for future disasters, end quote. So that your work is aware of these pitfalls. And my question is, how do we remain intellectually restless in climate change research, activism, and community work around resiliency theory? So for the moment, it just seems that resiliency theory is a bit too imprecise. Here, an islander from my ethnographic work in St. Martin, I do not want to be resilient anymore, right? And then here, Catherine McKittrick, and I quote, part of our intellectual task, she says, is to get in touch with the materiality of our analytical worlds. Part of our task is to read carefully and, when necessary, reckon with the materiality of metaphor. This is in their science. So McKittrick's work teaches that concepts actually orient ideas towards political praxis and world building, and as such, they ask us to attend to their very materiality. So that the materiality of my analytical world does not align with resilience. And so such theoretical and practical approaches require a critical inquiry, especially while attending to countermeasures for survival in the face of state inaction, abandonment, and global neglect, as you have outlined in your work so brilliantly. So, is resilience enough for thinking through how colonialism and coloniality, neoliberalism, and continued inequality forms Caribbean livability, right? All brought into sharp focus as we grapple with climate challenges, recovery, and water insecurity, as well as what Sylvia Winter calls the poverty, hunger, habitat, energy, trade, pollution, atmosphere, waste, resource problem, which she says we cannot disentangle or solve them separately, each on their own. So resilience here seems too thin and imprecise, and autogestion towards that aim seems fragile and filled with possibility, a harvest perhaps, or an offering. So rebuilding resilient communities in the face of climate events and their disastrous aftermath has become a prevalent aim. Conceptual approach and theoretical departure in Dutch Caribbean and larger Caribbean climate research and critical scholarship. So radical demands for change are eclipsed by endeavors that depend significantly on disaster resilience and rebuilding resilient communities. So here I offer the work of Christina Diprose, who argues that resilience is deployed as an inducement to putting up with precarity and inequality and accepting the deferral of demands for change. and as a means for relocating responsibility, which you address in your work. Chandler, as well as Alhut and Hernandez Torales, are critical of resilience, actually, since it encourages people to tolerate insecurity and inequity. So further, Deprose maintains that resilience is taken as a catch-all, endorsed in policy as a panacea for everything from floods to famine. Implicated in this concept of resilience is the ability to prepare for and withstand disaster, so as to return to the status quo, undergoing transformation for a return to the normal. So Chandler then makes clear that the status quo is the norm, which should be maintained or bounced back to in the face of potential or actual disruption. Imagining the future as merely a linear extension of the present. So then we have LeBron et al., who know that social capital can help build resilience to climate change by building adaptive capacity in socio-ecological systems and helping a system bounce back from its shock. It is this bounce back that I am particularly concerned about. Complicating this temporal bounce back to the normal, I consider Dion Brand's work, who says that normal is always in contention. Brand notes that returning to a normal narrativized as minor injustices or social ills is predicated on dis-ease and holding dis-ease intact. This dis-ease was always presented as something to be solved in the future. Brandes asked, was the violence against women normal? Was white supremacy normal? Was the homelessness growing on the streets normal? Were homophobia and transphobia normal? And then she asks, who would one have to be to sit in that normal restfully or to desire its continuance? Does building resilient communities, I asked, also mean building communities that are tolerant to continued adversity? Has this call for resilience ran its course, no longer serving to think through the inevitable natural disasters and catastrophes we face? Building social capital does come with a warning label. Rights in social capital can have unintended negative effects, such as restraining collective action or resulting in unequal resource distribution. And this is pointed out by LeBron as well as your work. So through the above, I question whether such a direct aim on resilience offers rigorous critical fodder in the face of climate events, in practices of autogestion, in building social capital. How is resilience still conceptually generative in thinking of and practicing other socialities, especially in the long durée of colonialism, enslavement, and continued ongoing practices of resistance? Notwithstanding its political intent or social purpose, has the concept and philosophical implications run its course? However, there remains a lack in theorizing and critical inquiry in a conceptual impact in scholarly, activist, and popular culture use of resilience, its historic legacy, the ascribed meanings brought to it, and the impact it has on Dutch Caribbean livability. Why, as a concept, has it remained proportionately uncomplicated in critical Caribbean intellectual work? And how does the concept as an idea connect to material realities that call for transgressive change of the normal, that call for reinvention that Dr. Roque's work offers a glimmer into with the regenerative possibilities of autogestion and social capital? So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. I first thank you for that thought-provoking commentary. I have so many notes and don't know what to start. I think that the thesis of your commentary is twofold. One, how the concepts, well, maybe threefold. One, how the concepts of autogestión and resilience find synergies, but at the same time crash. Two, how resilience thinking challenges or really allow us to, what is the bouncing forward or bounce back in the traditional definition of resilience? And then third, if autogestión in any way can bring in to think about these radical transformations towards the material realities that we're experiencing, correct? And some, okay. So for context, when I wrote and this is not, it's not a justification, but just to help in the way that my thinking around resilience has changed quite a bit since I wrote that first piece in 2020. So when I encountered the concept of social capital, and I was really trying to find a way to capture what I was seeing in these two communities that you have read in my work, right? Corcovado in Western Puerto Rico and Mariana in Eastern Puerto Rico. And like I said before, that for me, they're kind of outliers because they've been organized for so many years. They have certain characteristics, but they also spark opportunities to think about how communities can be organized in ways that they can address challenges of sustainability. When I think the concept of resilience, which is a global north concept, an ecological concept from Hollins in the 70s, it really is a concept of an ecology, right? The ability for a system to bounce back. And bouncing back in ecology is very different to bouncing back in social systems. More scholarship has come to challenge the critical approaches, to challenge through critical lenses what resilience means. And I think those are all really important to center because, as you well described presented in your commentary, resilience to what? Resilience to what, right? Like the reason why we have to engage in resilience as a social system, right? The idea that the center of the idea of resilience was to, in a positive, this concept has no critical lens in it, right? It's almost like you have this perfect world or this status quo system, and it gets impacted, and then you return back to it, and we're all happy, and it's all gonna be well. That's why autogestión in my second work tries to tease more of that criticalness of the possibilities of what happens when these communities are organizing. Are they organizing and they're using terms of we don't depend on anybody, we just go and act for ourselves? Are they using these terms because they're tired of the government or the structural systems that put them there in the first place? And what are the realities that they're trying to imagine for their own communities where they feel that they have some type of control over? So I have moved a lot of my thinking of resilience as a positive concept to think more about it as this critical lens of, resilience in an ideal world is a great concept. Is this idea we do need to have robustness. We do need to, we've always been impacted by natural hazards, and we'll continue to be impacted by it. So the idea of bouncing back, that robustness of a system, like a critical infrastructure system, is very much needed. Is very helpful to think about this. But in a social sense, I do agree that we need to challenge the roles and responsibilities of the state, the roles and responsibilities of the history that has put particularly Black and Brown communities and intersectional vulnerable communities in the forefront of being their own responders. And that's where resilience doesn't necessarily becomes resilient. It becomes survival, as many people have rightfully have argued for in the wake of state violence. I think that autogestión and a lot of the international literature and this work of autogestión as a neoliberal view comes from Ortiz, a scholar from Mexico. And in her work, she contextualize social capital too, not only autogestión, but also social capital as mechanisms that have been used by the International World Bank and a lot of international organizations to continue to let people, fakely empower people to be like, you can be your own, you can do this for your own community, you can be resilient for yourself, like use your social network, like it's all positive, positive, positive. But in reality, they're not changing the structure, the conditions, in this case, reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, so that communities don't have to engage in these in the first place. So I don't know if I'm necessarily answering your questions. I'm really more agreeing with the way that you have, structured your commentary, in that the bouncing, it's not, for me, it's not bouncing back, it's bouncing forward. And it's bouncing forward, thinking about shared values and objectives. That's why I talk about Corcovadas, these shared values and objectives around resilience. They have very clear in their head what resilience looks like, what sustainability looks like. And it's not as defined as maybe what we define it in the literature, but they see it in terms of like intergenerational knowledge transfer. They see it in that we want to protect our water quality. We want to not have to depend on fossil fuels. We want to have solar, like, because the energy grid is affecting us and we're an island and we can use our sun instead of using this exported fuels, right? So communities like Corcovado are enacting these thinkings about resilience and sustainability as the idea of bouncing forward into a better future. The work of Dr. Katia Brundiers, who was one of my professors during my PhD program, uses the concept of disasters as a window of opportunity. There's a window for sustainability. There's a window of opportunity when a disaster hits that that communities like Corcovado and Mariana utilize to bring in batteries and sustainability efforts through their linking social capital, particularly because they were already organized. And when the disaster hit, they were able to connect with different nonprofits and for-profit organizations. And they were like, what do you need? And they were ready to ask. And they were able to use that small window that many other communities weren't able because they were not as organized, because they were not tapping already into their own capacity, which is again why one of the reasons why I documented their experiences was to try to think from a government position at that time. What can we do within formal systems to support social capital in these communities? If you are going to continue to fail them, might as well create opportunities for communities to gather, to start building different types of capital, to start tapping in their own strengths. And I say strengths with a grain of salt, because as we know, Brown and Black communities have already a historical legacies of having higher poverty rates, having higher stressors, mental health, physical health. So while they're vulnerable by design, there's opportunities to still uplift them, right? And that goes beyond the power of what social capital can do. That means financial investment in these communities. That means better education system. And it kind of goes to the comment that I mentioned to Harold before, which was that it's political. It's a political agenda. You have to not only insert these changes within the communities, but you also have to change the power structures that make decisions to those communities. Because you can create a bubble like these communities do, rural communities do, but that bubble continues to be forced by external factors like outmigration, like state disinvestments, by more frequent and extreme weather events. And autogestión, as traditionally conceptualized and as many communities and organizations do in Puerto Rico, is an opportunity to do radical transformation. There's an organization called Casa Pueblo in Puerto Rico that mainly advocates for energy transitions. Casa Pueblo in the municipality of Adjuntas is one of the only communities in Puerto Rico that has solar panel in their urban center. And that solar panel, every time that everybody is without power in island-wide, they have power. And they have been over 30, 40 years advocating for thinking about autogestión in this more transformative way, but it is a political agenda. And it's a political agenda to change. And in the particular case of Puerto Rico, what has happened because of our relationship with the United States is that when you hear people, particularly people that advocate for climate change, they're usually downgraded as like, oh, those are leftist people. Those are the people that are going to take us to become Cuba, Venezuela, and Dominican Republic. Like there's a historical manufactured ignorance to residents and throughout our relationship with the United States that also hampers the opportunities for households to think freely of what transformation can look for their communities. There's some communities that have what I call broke the matrix, right? We're in this matrix because we are part of the United States and because we have US dollars, and then you have people in the media say, well, you don't want to lose your US dollar, you don't want to use your US passport. It's like ignorance. Like Dominican Republic, Cuba, these other countries, like they are way better than us right now. Cuba particularly experienced Fiona the same way that we experienced Fiona in September, this past September, and they recovered their electric grid in weeks. Like not in weeks, in days. It took Puerto Rico weeks for communities in the western side to recover. So a lot of these like narratives of resilience, of development also come from these historical legacies. And some communities have been able to break that matrix and others still are in the process to that. But as we continue to be hammered, right? We took out our governor, the one that privatized the system in the summer of 2019, because fury and tiredness of these systems just crashing upon us. For good or for bad, our relationship with the United States, our U.S. citizenship allow us to out-migrate in ways that not other communities can do so. And that, in my personal opinion, is a challenge because when people and from a long-term vision, right? Because a lot of households do what is best for their household, and we cannot, what's the word that I'm looking for? We cannot blame them to do what's best for their household. If they have to migrate, they have to migrate. I had to migrate because I needed to provide for my family. And I tried to repair that by doing community engaged work and bringing back as much as I can. But in a larger context, in the vision for what it means for a plan for the vision for the future of the country, these out-migration, these challenges in infrastructure, the lack of engagement in political parties, breaking the bipartisan, embracing what climate activists in Puerto Rico, academics, and other sectors, leaders, community leaders are doing, hammers the opportunities for transformation, but also is shedding a lot of light to ideas of autogestión as traditionally conceptualized and breaking some of this neoliberalism ways. Because that's why I focus in this talk about the neoliberalism part, because the people that engage in household water sharing, they were doing it under these norms of solidarity, but they were not planning to do this. There was not a political agenda to move it forward. And if the next event happens, they're gonna react rather than proact. So why can't we start thinking about this as a sustainable solution, so to help people start thinking about strategies that they can utilize to mitigate the impact of the hazard that we want it or not is still going to happen. But that does not equate to the roles and responsibilities of the state. Sorry, that was a little bit of a rant, but I hope I engaged in your commentary.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. I mean, that was rich, and it's a lot. So
yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot of like going between what's individual and what's at the structural vision for the future of the country, and in this case, the future for the Dutch Caribbean as well.
Thank you very much, Charissa. Yes, I am on mute. Thank you very much, Charissa, for your contribution. And now, actually, I get to make a presentation. And then afterwards, we go directly over into questions that persons may have. We already have two actually in the comment section. So I'm going to try to be as brief as possible with my contribution, and then we can go directly over into the questions. So first of all, greetings again to all, and it has certainly been a great pleasure to be here and to listen to Dr. Roque's presentation and also my colleagues' responses thus far. Also interesting for me were the various readings Dr. Roque shared with us, but in particular three which stood out to me because of my focus on power dynamics, policy development, and community engagement. And I addressed today from the perspective of Work Package 4, which addresses policy development and community engagement in relation to climate challenges in the SSS Islands. The first article was that of Community Engaged Scholarship in the Academy, an action agenda by Gelman, Jordan, and Seifer, which tackled the role of academic institutions in challenging narrow ideas of scholarship and making room for both community knowledge and scholars who involve themselves deeply with community initiatives. At a small resource-strapped institution like the one I am attached to, which exists in a layered country/kingdom political context, the question of how to make the institution more dynamic and community-oriented and how to access funding to do so remains at the forefront of considerations. And yet it is clear in Gelman, Jordan, and Seifer's article that if countries wish to tackle their most pressing challenges, in our case, the climate crisis, then community experts and community outreach must occur. The second article was that of Climate Justice and the Caribbean, an introduction by Baptiste and Riney, which explores several critical questions, including who most caused/causes climate challenges, who was/is most impacted by climate challenges, and also who was/is most responsible for mitigation and or adaptation as it relates to those challenges. In this case, the who referred mostly to the collective levels and especially to the sovereign states. This article also highlighted the concept of vulnerability and ways in which vulnerability was conceptualized by various scholars studying the Caribbean region. Salient also in this article was the unwillingness of scholars to separate vulnerability to or responsibility for climate adaptation and mitigation from social historical context, which I believe is very important in consideration of the kingdom political constellation. They write, and I quote, "With peripheral economies that are dependent for their development on nations of the core, the Caribbean states struggle to build strong economies that could compete in the global economic and political world system. That struggle continues in modern society where the region bears a significant social and environmental burden. The region is now expected to address the consequences of climate change, yet there is limited recognition within the global community of how the history of exploitation has limited the ability of Caribbean nations to effectively address climate change impacts, both in a reactive and proactive manner." And this made me think immediately, not just of how it's not considered for the global community, but also I think how it's not considered within this political constellation that is the Kingdom of the Netherlands. They also write, "Sovereign states must be the main enablers of this," and I put climate justice. This led me to the question, what happens when who is most responsible and who is most impacted coalesce in one political system where colonial power imbalances continue to influence relations to present day? Dr. Kimona Baez, one of my supervisors and lead investigator of Work Package 4, in discussing the core of this work package, speaks often to the importance of assessing and analyzing power dynamics in relation to policy developments around climate challenges and climate justice, particularly in relation to funding knowledge development and knowledge sharing. This idea was also reiterated in both the articles from Baptiste and Riney and Wise, LeBron, and Chase in The Eye of the Storm, Colonialism, Capitalism, and Climate in the Caribbean, where they discuss the ways in which political imbalances, disaster capitalism, and neocolonial power dynamics manifest on the island of Puerto Rico post-Hurricane Maria. While different, there are similarities to be found between Puerto Rico and St. Martin in relation to Hurricane Maria and Hurricane Irma. This article actually called to mind another article by Riney called Recipe for Resilience, tracing the biopolitics of St. Martin's recovery effort after Irma, in which he takes note of the tensions between the Netherlands and St. Martin, which have existed from the onset of the colonial period and continue to have a legacy today. He writes, "The post-Irma catastrophe has produced a unique problem space that has facilitated the deployment of a number of disciplinary strategies by The Hague aimed at subjecting the St. Martin government to a set of externally derived policies, discourses, and conditionalities. To the question of who should be held responsible, Baptiste and Rainey assert that Caribbean countries make negligible contributions to greenhouse gas emissions and suffer a double inequality where these countries contribute little to the overall cause of climate change while demonstrating a low capacity to resist and or recover from its effect. Redress to this, they assert, is climate justice. In discussing climate justice, Baptiste and Rainey state that global standards of justice have traditionally been applied in instances of war and where there have been cases of infringements on basic human rights. We would like to expand this argument, they write, by proposing that environmental resources that are shared globally within the commons must also be subjected to similar standards. This makes me revert back to the question that emerged to me in these readings, or while I was engaged with these readings. What happens when who is most responsible and who is most impacted coalesce in one political system where colonial power imbalances continue to influence relations to present day? Which led to an additional question of what happens when vulnerability is not only a consequence of geographical concepts, but also socio-political in origins. If we shift from global subtleties to a country-specific context, in a setting of imbalanced political dynamics of we betal about, so translated to who pays, decides, where are the spaces for countering erasure and promoting the sharing of resources based on basic human dignity and basic standards within this political kingdom. Baptiste and Rainey again writes, the deeper question that must be asked when looking at climate justice in the Caribbean is why we should be concerned about a region that has a small number of island nation states. In order to adequately address this question, we must look at the history of the Caribbean and the ways in which the region has contributed to the global political economy. Again, shifting from the more global context to the Dutch Caribbean context or the Dutch Kingdom context, the question could be rephrased as, why should we be concerned with non-sovereign island entities that have a small number of people? And the answer would be, in order to adequately address this question, we must look at the history of the Dutch Caribbean and the ways in which these islands have contributed to the political economy and global influence of the Netherlands. These authors write, as such, when we speak of climate justice, we must take into consideration the multiple perspectives, such as the history of nation states who have been exploited and left to build their economies with limited resources. How can we expect those who have suffered centuries of marginalization to now be at the forefront of addressing current problems of marginality within the limited available resources or with limited available resources? They continue, in the case of the Caribbean and other marginalized regions, who should be responsible for assuring that a community recovers from external threats? What are the methods or options of recovery that are needed? And who decides what these approaches will be? Since 2010, but also prior, local communities have, and when I talk about local communities, I'm speaking specifically to the SSS Islands where I'm doing my research, have been excluded from the development of policies and environmental governments, either by linguistic or cultural barriers or by political structures and processes. Research agendas and political strategies have been imposed by all levels of government, often without consulting or truly consulting those communities most affected by climate change and related inadequacies. On the islands, policy development often continues to have a top-down approach. Governments rarely, if ever, engage with communities around policy development, and if they do so, it is often in an information given rather than information receiving way. Back to Baptiste and Rainey. Justice must not be defined for the most impacted groups, but rather these groups must themselves be part of the defining process. Questions such as who gets access to funds, who administers the funds, what conditionalities are included in getting access to the funds must all be asked as a part of achieving justice. Though speaking about the region in general, these statements do not need much assistance in conjuring up real experiences for the territory of St. Martin post-Hurricane Irma. This brings me back to the idea of community engagement, or communities engaging with policy development around climate mitigation and or adaptation, which is at the core of my research, and also to the question of what role the institutions of higher education, in particular the university, must play and who must pay for said. Already from the conversation with folks on the ground, there emerges a general dis-ease with governments on both levels, particularly on the local level, because its actions are most directly seen and felt, to address through policy the safeguarding of the populace against climate catastrophe. There are those who question the ability of their local governments to ensure their well-being after major storms and or tensions which continue to exist around the role that the kingdom government should or should not play in the development of the islands, and the role that the government of the Netherlands should play in the development of the islands or should not play. So on the one hand, there are those who see independence as a way to finally forge the island's true autonomous destiny and to do things the Caribbean way, Caribbean often being rather free from European interference of colonial and perhaps the current era. They see independence as a way to enter regional discussions, prioritize local spending, and position themselves politically and economically in ways that they cannot currently entertain as a constituent country within this political constellation. However, for others, the era of independence is long gone, and present-day geopolitics and natural and socioeconomic threats call for a different understanding of and engagement with sovereignty within existing dynamics. Some of this latter group will quickly point to the assistance the Netherlands lends to the island in times of crisis, particularly pointing to hurricanes and their aftermath. This is countered, however, by those who assert that integration into and or the assistance from the Netherlands is not without its drawbacks, most notably conditions attached to, in particular, financial aid, and sometimes subtle, sometimes overt negation of local power and knowledge by those who come to assist. These tensions are layered, and with the political imbalance referenced prior coalesce to create vulnerabilities all their own. I would have wanted to delve a little bit deeper into this concept of vulnerability on the SSS Islands, but in the context of time, I will leave that for another time. So circling back to this idea of the university and what is the role of it in bringing communities together for both knowledge sharing and knowledge receiving. Sometimes it appears that it is the desire for these institutions with very little resources to create something out of nothing. And I think for me, this is something that has to be taken into consideration in context of the current political dynamics, and also, and also within the context of the idea of climate justice that we're talking about. You know, who actually pays for these institutions to do the work that they need to do, taking into consideration their current realities. So I actually wanted to end with words from a book. It's a rather old book from St. Martin called Wind Above the Hills. And it actually, the title of the poem is Frederick of September 3rd, 1979. He came in a hurry, then decided to stay on my beautiful island. It was just in his way. Not quite a devil, but no angel was he, for after he left us, that you could plainly see. Was it his temper or plain devilish way that caused him to lash and disfigure our bait? Or was it a tantrum he had to release that made him in violence disturb our peace? Whatever the intent, it was all marked destroy, for after he left us, the island seemed void. He had torn at the roots and uprooted huge trees and frightened us all as he howled through the eaves. This terrible monster was followed that day by his mistress, a vixen, in every which way. She quarreled and hissed and poured down her ire. Water, more water, it was worse than fire. At last they left us, thank God, what a relief, but only to face worry, trouble, and grief. Our town is afloat in a terrible way. The faces we meet are all marked with dismay. The people of the SSS Islands have long had to grapple with the devastation of and rebuilding after major storms. Their voices should also be at the forefront of climate change policy development on local, kingdom, and international levels. And that was my contribution. And I thank you very much. I have a couple of questions, but there were already 2 questions in the chat. So first, I'll allow you to give a response if you have anything, and then afterwards, I'll pose the 2 questions from Ellen and then any other questions that we may have.
Thank you so much for that response. Also took a lot of notes. Hopefully I can answer to the rich fullness of what you have just presented. So I think the center point here is thinking about climate justice and what does that mean for the Caribbean, who enacts that, and what role does the university can play in this. And I kind of also put it in like grain of salt in terms of the resources, because I know, for example, in the University of Puerto Rico, how the government has basically continued to disinvest it in ways that it makes it extremely challenging for researchers, for teachers to do community engaged work when they have higher teaching loads and just this investment in their big centers, and they continue to do that amidst all these compounding challenges that they experience. So with the role of the university, I think that as scholars, as researchers, as students, we are able to support capacity training and are able to create connections. I think that the ability, thinking about linking social capital, particularly the university, as researchers, we do have certain connections depending on our discipline or depending where we are in our stage to different organizations and institutions of power. And we can be, I think for me, that's always been one of my thinking, be a bridge between university knowledge and the academic and the communities that it serves. So I think that those are the two big ones. I think that these questions of who pays, who should be responsible, who should be moving these ideas forward, it not only relies on the university, it relies really on every sector involved, and that we do what we can with the limited resources that we do. Islanders at the Helm is one extraordinary example of trying to move those ideas forward. But as I mentioned in my talk, these things take time, they take resources, they take also capacity training within our teams, because we were not trained necessarily to do this type of scholarship. And a lot of it, I think it comes from our own passions, from seeing our experiences, working with communities in one form or another, and having just that willingness and that drive, personal drive to engage in this change and seeing how our countries are being devastated by these phenomena. I think that similar, like I've said before, it's also a very being a scholar activist is an explicit political agenda, that these issues, we know who are the responders, we know who are the polluters, we know who are the institutions that are doing these stuff, and that we have to try to find middle grounds with them, but also front and center the historical legacies that have led to this, right? And climate justice is a great concept to think about these things, and that's why I also brought into the conversation restorative justice, because it puts in perspective the offender and the offended, right? Like the person that creates these issues and the person that are being impacted. And without centering the people that are being impacted, we will continue to develop colonial type of changes. We think that we know what the communities need, but if we're not directly in conversations with them, we don't know what they mean. The other thing that I'll say quickly about this is that I think that for academics, and now that I don't know necessarily how those configurations occur in your several institutions, but I know for in my institution, as a research one, which is a research intensive institution, funding is a big thing and research is a big thing. So there is definitely a lot of benefits in terms of financially to enact these things. That's why I talked about in my talk about the value of students and tapping in other resources that are within the university, like art centers and beyond, that not necessarily inquire a lot of financial capital, but they are there and they might be willing and interested in engaging in this type of work. The second thing is that because I particularly that I'm in this process of the tenure track, like publications is my currency. What I have found to be very helpful is to engage in collaborations where I have the opportunity, because they take more time and resources to engage, that and publish with with other collaborators, right? So putting myself in different pots helps balance what I need my institution to continue being in this space, but also my values and my drive to be in academia in the first place. Because if I weren't in academia, I think I would be in the nonprofit sector or in other type of sector that I feel that there could be more connections. I know we're running out of time. So the last thing, the last thing that I will say within the policy spaces is that that is still a very that's a question in motion. It is challenging to engage democratic processes and policy space, especially when they don't want this change. So it's a lot of power, force. Mm-hmm. So that's where bridging social capital comes in, because you can connect with different organizations that have these shared values and understandings, and use them in a way to move forward into more policy spaces. And that's where like political capital comes in. And I'm happy to discuss that another time, but I know our time is limited. So yeah.
Yes, it's definitely, and we're running out of time. We have about 13 minutes left, and I know we already have some questions in the chat. So actually we have one from one of your country folk, Jaime. So I think you're still in the room. So if you want to just unmute yourself and ask your question, that would be great, actually. And then I'll go and see who else is.
I'll read Jaime's question because Jaime has a throat infection. So one of the things that Jaime asked is, I'll read the second one, what community engagement practices you have designed for your research, and above all, what you have done to navigate all these research regulations that sometimes seem to sensitively interfere with the basic goal of working together with community members, or even sharing with them research tools so that they can do research themselves. So if there is no time, okay, yeah, so that's the question. What kind of models have you created, and how do you work around your goal of working together with community members when that might be inhibited?
Thank you. Thank you, Jaime, for that question. So I've used mainly community-based community-based participatory research, which is more than a method, it's a framework to think about partnerships and engage them at every step of the process. This has been successful in some cases and not successful in others, like with any research. Particularly, everything just really starts with thinking who my community partners will be and asking them what's their time and availability to engage in a project, and depending on that is how the project is then restructured. I've used photo voice, which is a photo engaged participatory methodology. Our team that looks at issues of water insecurity in the US-Mexico border developed a new method called community-based participant observations. And that method is intended to co-create a community protocol that allows communities to be the own observers of their community challenges. So it puts into the community, into residents in this particular case, the opportunity to document their own experiences and use that as the forefront of how the research is designed. And it's co-designed throughout like this different steps of a research process, from like share objectives, research questions, what are the questions that the observation protocol tool will have, and so forth. And then in terms of the challenges, I think this might relate to the IRB, the Institutional Review Board. I don't have a great answer to that. Is embracing, because it takes so much time. That's why I mentioned earlier the idea of tapping into collaborations, but then also having your individual projects, because these more community engaged work takes more time. And the IRB is intended to make it, more difficult, because they really want to make sure that the university is not at risk. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Okay, great. So if there are those or others who have questions, like please just indicate by raising your hand or using the raise your hand function, or just actually raising your hand, and one of myself or one of my colleagues will see that you would like the mic. So if there are more questions, I would like to, Jay has his hand up?
Yeah.
Okay, yes, then Jay, go ahead, unmute yourself.
Thank you, short and sweet. Thank you very much, Anaís. It was a very dynamic and exciting presentation. I very much enjoyed it. And I'm particularly inspired from this conversation relating to resilience. I think that is an absolutely important direction that you and everyone with Charissa as well are going. I do have a question though about a certain, you point out that the term justice is a very significant semantic importance, but then you use this phrase social capital. And I have a little bit of a question about the term capital that you're using, because what I'm hearing you describe are processes. Mm-hmm. It's not capital as much as it is these different dynamics. Terms like social dynamics or social responses seems to be, to me, more adequate to what you're describing than capital, which of course is fundamental to an antithesis to a lot of what a root word to capitalism being, you know, antithesis. So I just make that as a comment that what I'm seeing in your discussions are processes and not so much social capital as social dynamics.
That's a really good point, and thank you for your comments. So yes, I definitely try to talk about social capital when I do presentations in these processes forms, because I'm trying to think about it and how you can operationalize it. But the literature on social capital is more on this like network perspective, right? And thinking about these underlying shares values. But definitely there's other bodies of literature that are very complementary to the work that social capital does. And in terms of the justice component, I think that that the interplay between justice and social capital at the same time with resilience thinking is that justice is our, in my view, justice is our quest. We're not there yet. And we can use social capital as a means to an end to get to that quest. While resilience in the ideal world where we have already achieved justice, then it would be helpful because for certain systems, particularly for infrastructure systems, it's important to have that idea of bouncing back to a system, a sustainable system. So communities engage in bouncing forward dynamics because we haven't engaged there, right? We're trying to operationalize and think about how can we build these more sustainable practices. But the overarching goal, to try to wrap this up, is that justice is what we should be thinking about, but not using the word but, nonetheless, social capital is one of those ways that you could operationalize towards achieving that end goal.
I see what you mean by the concept of social capital. It's just that I'm having a little bit of a qualm with the word capital itself, the use of the word capital. I mean, it's a semantics issue that strikes a bell in my head. So thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you so much.
Dr. Roque, before we end, we actually have two questions from Dr. Van Buren, who left. So she asked, do you have examples of public-private people partnerships or any combination of this that have been / are being institutionalized, allowing a more responsive, proactive or / proactive in organized response? And then she also asked, to what extent do you feel that the neoliberal vis-a-vis autogestion are theories that help in building sustainable solutions? So I don't know if you could tackle those two questions before we begin to wrap up.
Yes, so in terms of the examples of public-private partnerships, I can't think of one on top of my head. I do know that in Puerto Rico, public-private partnerships has been one of the things that have been challenged because they have been corrupted in a sort. But there are examples in other parts, and one of my articles around building social capital, I highlight them, but I apologize because I can't think about them right now. But in terms of to what extent I feel that neoliberal vis-a-vis are theories to help in building sustainable solutions, I think that they are in terms of thinking how the structural dynamics of neoliberalism, colonialism, you name it, are present in the ways that households and communities respond. So, for example, in the case of water sharing, if people are responding without, if people are engaging in water sharing techniques without proper capacity building and training, and it doesn't move forward the structural dynamics that put them in the first place, then it's highlighting then this neoliberal perspective, rather that if these are pre-thought practices and plan towards when a hazard occurs, then that aligns more with the radical transformation views of autogestión. So it's more to put them in perspective that when communities are engaging in these dynamics, are they doing them just to survive, or are they doing them because this can become a long-term sustainable strategy or solution?
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. I've thoroughly enjoyed the day. And now I'm going to invite Dr. Guadalupe to sort of wrap up and close. And I enjoyed the reading, so thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Dr. Guadalupe, the mic is now yours.
I will be brief, Anaís. It was really a lovely presentation. You are definitely an activist scholar, because you made that 100% clear that is the route you're taking. There are a couple of things I found very interesting that is still food for thought for me and perhaps for the entire group. And one of the things is your alternative to neoliberalism, which seems to be a concrete liberalism with social capital theories and so forth. So that, and even the question of sovereignty is still within the liberal order of nation states. So it's interesting that is where you seem to be going in that. So that I found interesting to observe in your presentation. So it gives me food for thought in relation to that move that is made. So all I can say is thank you very much. I have a PhD student that is studying Casa Pueblo, so something similar. And there you see a similar move being made from neoliberal to a kind of concrete liberalism. So that's interesting, and a bolstering of the liberal order of nation states as a possible way of getting out of the predicament. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll quickly say to your comment that while that it's kind of the move, I do think that the alternative of neoliberalism has to be centered by what the people think, right? For me, it's more about abolishing all these systems that put us in these uneven equal relationships, but I don't necessarily have an answer of what the full alternative looks like. It's definitely something that I'll continue to work around, because it is part of that 3 ... what is our future then gonna look like if we're not following certain patterns. and choose other patterns, and what are the unintended consequences of choosing other ways beyond neoliberalism and colonialism. Yeah. But again, thanks everyone for the time. It's just an honor and a pleasure to be in conversations with you all. Please keep me in touch if there's other opportunities to be in conversation, not necessarily as a speaker, but just learning more about your work. There's publications or anything out there that you guys are doing. I would love to continue in conversations and learn more about what the Dutch Caribbean is engaging in. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. I guess, Lysanne, the floor is yours, right?
That's it. We're wrapping up for the day. Thank you to everybody who came out, and we will see you at our next stakeholder session. So stay tuned for that.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Charissa, do you have a minute?
Yes.